Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we learn and study and hopefully provide some tips and some strategies for thinking through what works best for you, but also maybe unlearning some bad habits that we've developed along the way. Our plan is going to be that I'm going to talk through some of the barriers that do appear and get in the way of our learning, some of the things that we believe about studying or about our ability to learn. Then we're going to talk about the differences between studying and learning so that we can identify some tools for improving our own strategies and plans. And then I want to discuss how you can make a plan so that wherever you're at, and whether it's the beginning of the semester, the middle, or the end, you can make some adjustments that will help you see greater chances for success in everything that you're attempting to do in your class. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that get in our way when it comes to studying. The first is something that we call learned helplessness. So sometimes based on whatever experience that we've had in the past, we start to feel like no amount of effort is going to bring success, right? So if we've spent a long time reading or outlining or trying to memorize or cramming the night before or whatever it might look like, if that hasn't led to the outcome that you were hoping for, sometimes that then creates a mental block for us to find new ways to learn and study and to incorporate those so that we can actually change some of our habits and ultimately outcomes. So what can we do to change that? Well, we need to understand the causes of that sense of learned helplessness. We need to understand the things that we've been doing that haven't been serving us. And then we need to make sure that we can adjust those misperceptions. We need to have access to tools that can refute those distorted beliefs and strategies that we can put into place, maybe even one by one, so that we can finally shift our own thinking and plans around this. We also need to understand a little bit of the difference between studying and learning, because it turns out they're actually different and they're going to lead to very different outcomes, whether or not we're thinking in terms of those perspectives. So first, I want you to reflect a little bit on how you would prepare for the following things: trying to get a good grade on a test, or teaching material to your entire class, right? These are two very different things. And if you are going to have to give a presentation, and if you're going to have a lot of knowledge about a subject and be able to respond to questions, what you do to prepare for that is actually probably looking pretty different from what you do in order to take an exam, or as I like to call them, a celebration of knowledge. My students love to roll their eyes at that. But the idea is, what do you work harder for as one metric, but also what are the actual things that you do in order to prepare? It turns out that studying isn't necessarily the same as learning that material. What you're doing for an exam is studying and likely cramming. And what you're doing to prepare to present information as a subject matter expert is learning so that you can teach. This has been really true in my own lifetime, in my own experience. I didn't know anything as well as I knew it once I started teaching, even part-time, right after my master's degree, when I was just a young instructor trying to figure out exactly what to do. I had to go back and read a lot of information that I had already been taught or thought that I had learned in order to be more effective in the classroom. In order to really address some of these things and help prepare better, we should be engaging in what we call metacognition. My students will be familiar with the term metacommunication, right? Communication about communication. Metacognition is thinking about one's own thinking. We have to become consciously aware of the way that we address problems and the way that we see ourselves as a problem solver. And in order to really engage in this, we have to monitor, plan, and then work to control our own mental processing. So we have to ask questions while we're working. Am I understanding this? Am I only memorizing it? Could I explain it to a peer, or better, could I explain it to somebody who's not in the class in a way that would make sense? And that will help us to more accurately judge our own level of learning. But this is a process within the process of studying and learning, and probably not one that we've had big conversations about as students in our lives. This can be helpful in a number of contexts, but in particular, when we're looking at the university setting, this is a big shift in terms of how we think about preparing for courses. When we're working on reading and homework, there actually are some evidence-based processes that help us to create a better homework system. And so this 5-step process, and we're going to review this again in a few minutes in a different way, says that we need to study information before looking at problems or questions, right? So we want to actually engage in the content, engage in the material. Then we're going to practice applying this information that we have now, right? So we might work example problems, we might look at questions in textbooks or in modules or in classes so that we can think through what are potential answers to that without actually looking at solutions. This might actually mean even looking at key words, and without looking at the glossary or where there's answers for that, can you define them? You want to practice that and then check to see if your answer or what you're thinking is correct. If it's not correct, you want to figure out where the mistake was made. What was the misunderstanding? Where was the disconnect in the material without actually looking at the final answer? And then you want to work through homework and answer questions as if you're taking a test, right? If assessments or celebrations of knowledge or exams are a really big part of the way your performance is being evaluated, you want to make sure that you're enacting that process in your homework and in your learning efforts so that you can build confidence and also really effective strategies and tools for approaching the work that you're doing in that way. Most students have a lot of questions about what does this look like when you're reading through material, especially at the university level. There's often a lot of reading throughout a week, and I know that it can start to feel overwhelming, and you might not necessarily feel like you have the ability to spend the time and put in the effort. But if we actually engage in a reading strategy that works and do it effectively, we often say you do need to read more than once. But even if you're only willing to commit enough time to read through something once, if you're doing it in a way that is leading to more comprehension and more memory associated with it, then actually that effort at the beginning will save you some time when you're trying to learn things or remember things again for assignments or exams. So some of the tips that you want to think about is actually preparing yourself for the chapter or the article or work that you're going to read. I always tell my students, it seems counterintuitive, but start at the end. Actually look at the conclusion, the summary, the key words that are at the end of a chapter so that you know what are the learning outcomes associated with this piece of information, instead of just going in and saying, oh, I wonder what this will be about today. The heading, the title of the chapter isn't going to give you the level of detail. Then you should think through what are some of the questions you think this reading will answer. This can actually help you to think through what are potential homework questions, what are potential exam questions, what do I think this information is providing, what problems is this solving for me, for the world, for this subject. And then when you read, really read. And this might mean one paragraph at a time. I know for me, there are lots of times where I am reading through something and then I don't know how I got to the sentence that I'm at, right? Because I'm not really engaged in that careful and effortful reading. This again involves more focus and more concentration. So it can be really important to set up your environment in a way that makes sense for you. Recitation, right? The summarization of things in your own words. So can you explain back what you're reading through paraphrasing? Can you explain this to somebody else? If you can't, you probably want to reread. You want to actually take notes while you're reading, okay? Maybe you annotate in the margins. Maybe you have some kind of outline that you set up for yourself to write in while you're reading through, especially if you're planning on selling back that book and you want to try to keep it as clean as possible. A lot of research tells us that handwriting actually leads to better comprehension. So those of us with the ability to do that, even though it seems anachronistic, a little old school, that can be really beneficial. You can always type them up later. That's a practice that I engaged in, certainly in college and in graduate school, so that they were organized and I could get back to them. And also, I have terrible handwriting. And so, if I did that really quickly, I'm already reviewing my notes so that I can get them into a document that's clearer. And then you want to review. What is the information that you did summarize? What's in your notes, right? What does this information look like? Again, paraphrased in your own words. And then reflect. What are some other views? What are some questions that remain based on that initial survey that you did of the information? Do you think that you can answer the questions that you thought might be answered in that work? I acknowledge that this sounds like a lot of work and a lot of time, and really to be as successful as most of us might want to be, or how we might define it in terms of earning grades, we do have to engage in some of this level of effort at some point. But if you do it right the first time, you won't have to reread it as many times as you might be right now. It's also really valuable to understand the learning categories that a lot of your questions, a lot of your homework, a lot of the assessments and tasks you're given are actually falling under. So in education, we actually have something called Bloom's Taxonomy, and it's something that most educators have learned about at some point in their careers. But it basically says that there's a pyramid structure of the things that we want to be able to do with information that we're learning. And at the very bottom level are things like remembering, right? Just memorizing and then maybe understanding. So having a clear ability to think through the meaning of something. You're not just memorizing a word and the words that come after it, but you do understand what that word means. These are at the bottom of the pyramid and tend to be things that we spend a lot of time on in a lot of our intro classes because we want to be able to have a base level of knowledge. And then as you move up that your pyramid, you're going to start working on applying that information, analyzing and evaluating, right? Maybe looking at cases or case studies, maybe having to pick out what would be the best concept or theory in order to explain something. You have a more critical eye, you're able to critique information that's presented to you. And finally, you're going to get to that creating level where you're creating meaning and information on your own. This is another visualization of Bloom's taxonomy that has a little bit more information about what each category looks like. So remembering might be recalling relevant information, relevant knowledge from our long-term memory. This is vocabulary often in your exams. Understanding as being able to construct meaning and interpret, maybe be able to identify an example, classify or summarize something. This is also used when you're comparing concepts. Applying, being able to actually do something, carrying out or using a procedure and implementing it. Analyzing, looking at breaking material into parts, understanding how those relate to one another, being able to see it in an overall structure. Evaluating, making judgments based on criteria and standards through checking and critiquing, and then creating or synthesizing all of these elements together so that you can form a coherent and functional whole. It might look like reorganizing elements into a new pattern or structure through generating, planning, or producing. I'm going to give you just a quick couple of seconds to look at that a little bit more and reflect maybe on where you see most of your class experiences, and also thinking about what are the parts of this pyramid that you find easier or more interesting, and what are the ones that you struggle with. Okay, so because I'm speaking more about what our experiences are like in college, sometimes it's helpful to think about maybe what we spent a lot of time doing and preparing for before we arrived to college and what that looks like now. So, most students say that in order to do well in high school, they mostly needed to remember. So, it was a lot of memorization, a lot of vocabulary, a lot of regurgitating information, and maybe there was a shift to a little bit of understanding, a little bit of being able to see that in context and be able to really explore meaning on a larger scale. Oftentimes, we hear from students that they were even given answers to exams in high school. And so it truly was memorization of what is the answer to this specific question, and not necessarily being able to recognize that information in other questions or in other contexts or assessments. In college, most students say that they find they're expected to do a lot more applying and a lot more creating. So you're probably writing more, you're constructing your own arguments, you're having to show that you can take the information that you've learned and then apply it to a case or a scenario or a problem. And that is a lot more complex and takes a different kind of learning effort than it does to simply memorize something or focus on things like flashcards. So even thinking a little bit about what are the things you're being asked to do and how prepared are you to do them is part of that metacognition, right? Thinking about how we think and also how we've been trained to think so that we can make some changes. So here's a study cycle that has been produced and published as a highly recommended way for students to engage with their material. You're going to look at this and you're going to think, well, I don't know, Dr. Sandoval, that seems like a lot. It's not, right? And so again, it's about setting aside that time and that focus. And if you're able to engage in this level of efforting early on, then you might not have to repeat the process as many times. But this again, you preview, right? Before your class, before your module, look at that material, note the big ideas, pay attention to those summaries and that vocabulary. You're going to attend, right? So that might mean attend a physical class. It might mean attend to a lecture or information that you have available online, but you want to be present. You want to take notes. If you're watching this video now, it might be a good idea to take some notes about what is particularly helpful, and then ask questions of yourself and also of your instructor and your peers. Engage in that discussion. You want to review. So after you've attended class, after you've gone through that module, look at your notes and make sure you're spending time filling in the gaps. What are the things that you didn't quite get? Study. All right, so this is a focused study session, right, where you're going to actually look at your material in a focused way. And I'm going to go over some more information about that in a second. And then you're going to check yourself, right? Can I teach this material to someone else? Is my study method working for me? That is why it can be really helpful to have a study group. And there's lots of ways to still do that remotely through technology. But when you have to answer a question that somebody else asks you and then say, do you get it? That's a lot more helpful than just saying, do I think I've memorized this concept from my book? All right, here's that focus study session. This, you're going to plan, right? Decide what is it that you want to accomplish in your study session. What are your goals? And then you want to actually, I suggest writing it down, thinking about it really clearly, making it a really concrete plan. You're going to study, which means you interact with the material. You're going to organize. You might draw out a concept map. If helping yourself create a visual understanding of things is really important to you, spend the time to do it. Summarize, process the information, maybe reread if you need to. Take a break. If you're going to be truly focused and not distracted, and it's easy for me to engage in a lot of distracted writing and studying, where I have a lot of other things on, a lot of other things that I'm thinking about. But if I'm super focused, or even 30 minutes, then I can take a break. And then I'm going to go back and recap, go back over it and figure out if what I did in that amount of time was effective enough, or if I need more time. Do I need to walk away from this for a minute? Do I need to change my approach, change tasks, maybe switch to another class or subject in order to be more effective? And then rinse and repeat, right? You're going to do this as many times as is necessary for everything that you're working on. It's also important to think a little bit about mindset. This is going to matter. This has been a big topic of conversation in the last decade. Do we have a fixed intelligence mindset or a growth intelligence mindset? Because fixed intelligence says you're smart or you're not, right? You have a certain amount of intelligence and you can't do anything about it. But a growth intelligence mindset says intelligence can be developed and you can grow it through behavior and actions and engagement. I think a lot of us grew up with the idea that intelligence is static. And there is some additional research that's really interesting about talking to kids and young people when we say things like, oh, you're so smart, look how well you did, that actually makes that really concrete for them. Instead of saying, hey, you did so well, you worked so hard, right? Great effort, great work, leading to that, instead of just saying you're smart, because then they say, well, I'm smart or I'm not. And then if they don't do as well the next time, they think they must have been wrong. I'm not really smart. And that can really create a very specific outlook on learning when we hear those messages as young people. Understanding our mindset a little bit, right? When we have a fixed intelligence mindset, we avoid challenges. We might give up easily because we get frustrated, right? It doesn't feel like we can actually move out of that. It doesn't even feel like it makes sense to try. Sometimes this can happen if we do poorly on an early assignment or exam. And so we just say, well, I guess this is just how it is. I can't fix this. So any feedback that I got, I'm just going to forget about it. Other people are doing well, it's because they're smarter than I am, not because they're doing anything differently. And also understanding that a lot of this has to do with context and environment and resources, and we can't take that out of the equation, right? And it's really important to keep in mind that some of us have had more learning resources over time. Some of us have more capacity now to engage in things depending on our care responsibilities, other things that we have to deal with. So have grace for yourself in terms of understanding this too, but make sure that you have a growth mindset about your intelligence. If you have less capacity or less resources right now, that's very different than thinking you can't possibly do better if you had that situation. With a growth mindset, we're going to embrace challenges. We're going to be resilient and persist when things are hard. We're going to understand that effort is actually giving us a path towards true understanding and maybe even mastery of a concept. We learn from criticism, and we find the success of others as inspirational and something to help us understand how to do better ourselves. Okay, so that's a pretty quick introduction to thinking about learning and studying, but hopefully it helps you think through what is the plan that you're going to make? How are you going to adjust your own study habits? How are you going to embrace some of the learning challenges you might be facing? I want to recognize this takes time and effort, but it is evidence-based advice. This is information that we know works across a wide range of students. If this is all really overwhelming, pick one thing to change, pick one habit to adjust, try one focused study session, write up your plan. Make a plan about how much time that you are going to put into each assignment every semester, every term, at the beginning of it. Create a learning plan for the whole 6 to 16 weeks. And then create your own motivations. What are things that you can do? If you get through a 45-minute focused study session, what is something that you can do to celebrate successfully getting through that? Is it taking a social media break? Is it getting in a quick workout? Is it calling somebody that you want to talk to? Is it taking the time to enjoy your favorite caffeinated beverage so you can get back to it, right? Think about things that you can look forward to and reward yourself throughout the process with things that will continue to keep you motivated and healthy and happy along the way. All right, I know you can do it. I have full faith in your ability to engage and to be efforting in this particular way. And I hope this helps you a little bit along your path to becoming the student that you want to be and learning everything that will help you be as successful as you want in every endeavor.